A young black girl sleeps in a hospital every single night, hiding in the shadows where no one notices her. But when a doctor discovers her heartbreaking secret, his world is forever changed. She's not just a visitor. She's a child desperate to stay close to her unconscious mother, clinging to hope in the darkest of times. What will happen when the doctor learns just how much she's endured, and how far he'll have to go to save her family? This story will take you on an unforgettable journey of heartbreak, courage, and redemption that will leave you in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Ruby pressed herself against the cold hospital wall. Her heart thumped so loud she was sure someone would hear it. The night security guard's footsteps echoed down the hallway, getting closer and closer, each step making her pulse race faster. Ruby held her breath, her fingers pressing into the smooth surface behind her. She'd memorized his routine over the past few days of watching, spending hours tracking his movements. 3 more steps and he'd turn left, away from where she hid, just like clockwork. Just as she predicted, the guard's heavy boots squeaked as he rounded the corner. Ruby counted to 10 before darting through the main entrance, her worn sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floor. The rubber soles were so thin she could feel every crack in the tiles beneath them. The hospital at night was different, eerier, with shadows stretching across empty corridors like long fingers reaching for her. Every beep from a distant machine made her jump, and the occasional whoosh of automatic doors sent shivers down her spine. Ruby clutched her backpack straps tighter, thinking of her mom lying still in the ICU, tubes and wires everywhere, her face pale against the white sheets. "Stay strong, Ruby girl," she whispered to herself, repeating her mother's words like a prayer. Grace had always told her that Thompson women never gave up no matter what. Those words had gotten Ruby through countless tough times before. Ruby ducked behind a supply cart as a nurse walked past, her shoes squeaking on the tiles. The smell of antiseptic burned her nose as she waited, hardly daring to breathe. When the coast was clear, she slipped into the elevator, pressing the button for the pediatric floor with trembling fingers, watching the numbers light up one by one. The pediatric ward welcomed her with its familiar rainbow-painted walls and cartoon characters, their cheerful faces a stark contrast to the darkness outside. Ruby moved quickly to her spot, a quiet corner near the big window where she could see the whole city spread out below like a blanket of twinkling lights. She arranged 2 plastic chairs together, making sure they wouldn't wobble, a skill perfected over many nights. Her thin jacket wasn't much of a blanket, but it would do. The fabric was worn soft from repeated washings, and it still smelled faintly of home. Ruby settled in, pulling out the medical book she'd found abandoned in the hospital library. The pages were worn and dog-eared, but the words inside fascinated her. Words like diagnosis and treatment danced before her tired eyes, each one a step closer to understanding what was happening to her mother. "Mom," she whispered, touching the book's cover reverently, "I'm learning all about what the doctors do. Maybe one day I can help people like you. Maybe I can make sure no other kid has to watch their mom get sick like this." The city lights twinkled below through the large window, and above them, stars dotted the dark sky like tiny diamonds scattered across black velvet. Ruby's mind drifted to their tiny apartment, empty and scary without her mom's warm presence. The thought of going back there alone made her shiver. The silence was too loud, the spaces too big without Grace's laughter filling them. "I know you'd probably be mad if you knew I was here," Ruby murmured, looking up at the stars as if they could carry her message. "But I can't leave you alone, Mom. I won't." Her voice cracked a little, thick with unshed tears. "I'm not going anywhere until you wake up. Thompson women stick together, remember?" Her eyelids grew heavy as she curled up on her makeshift bed, the medical book hugged close to her chest like a teddy bear. The quiet hum of the hospital surrounded her like a lullaby, mixing with the distant sounds of night staff going about their rounds. Slowly, Ruby drifted off to sleep under the watchful gaze of the stars, dreaming of the day her mother would open her eyes and smile at her again. Dr. Michael Carter rubbed his tired eyes as he scribbled his signature on yet another patient chart. The pediatric ward's nurses' station felt like his second home, especially during these long evening shifts. The familiar scent of antiseptic and the soft hum of medical equipment had become as natural to him as the smell of coffee in his own kitchen. He glanced at his watch, 9:17 p.m. Just a few more charts to go. Movement caught his eye. A small figure walked past, head down, shoulders hunched. A young girl, maybe 11 or 12, with neat braids and a backpack that had seen better days. The fabric was worn at the corners and a small tear had been carefully mended with blue thread. Dr. Carter watched as she quickly disappeared around the corner. "Hey, Sarah," he called to the nurse beside him, his voice naturally gruff despite his gentle intention. "That girl. Is she with one of our patients?" Sarah barely looked up from her computer, her fingers continuing their steady rhythm on the keyboard. "Didn't notice, Doctor. Carter. Probably visiting hours running late again." He nodded, returning to his paperwork, but something nagged at him, an instinct honed by decades of working with children. Over the next hour, as he moved between patients and updated their charts, he kept spotting the same girl. She'd appear in the waiting area, then vanish into quiet corners. Each time she moved like a shadow, quick, quiet, trying not to be seen. Dr. Carter frowned as he watched her dodge another nurse, sliding behind a supply cart with practiced ease. Her behavior seemed practiced, like she knew exactly when to move and where to hide. The way she navigated the hospital corridors reminded him of a dancer who had memorized every step of a complex routine. He should probably check it out, but right then his pager buzzed. A patient in room 304 needed immediate attention. By the time he finished dealing with the emergency, just a scared kid with a nosebleed that wouldn't stop, he'd almost forgotten about the mysterious girl. Almost. But as he walked past the pediatric ward's quiet area, wiping the last traces of antiseptic from his hands, he spotted her again. She sat in the furthest corner, partially hidden by a large potted plant. The ficus leaves cast gentle shadows across her face under the soft lighting, and she was absorbed in what looked like a thick book. Her small frame seemed to melt into the shadows as if she'd perfected the art of being invisible. Her fingers traced the lines as she read, a habit he'd noticed in many young readers. Dr. Carter finished his shift, gathering his things from his office and stuffing a few patient files into his worn leather bag. Before heading out, he made one last round through the ward. The girl was still there, turning pages with careful fingers, completely oblivious to his presence. As the night shift staff began arriving, trading greetings and updates in hushed voices, Dr. Carter walked toward the exit. He paused at the door, looking back one more time. The girl hadn't moved from her spot, her face still buried in her book. Something about her solitary figure stirred his concern, awakening the protective instinct that had drawn him to pediatrics in the first place. He made a mental note to watch for her tomorrow night. Dr. Carter sat in his dimly lit office, patient charts spread across his desk. But his mind kept drifting to the mysterious young girl he'd seen in the pediatric ward. Something about her furtive movements and worn backpack wouldn't let him rest. The way she'd hurried past his office earlier that day, head down and shoulders hunched, struck him as all too deliberate. He checked his watch, 8:30 p.m., earlier than his usual rounds, but tonight he had a purpose. Gathering a few charts as a pretense, he made his way to the pediatric wing, the quiet hum of medical equipment filling the evening air. Right on cue, she appeared. Her small frame moved with practiced stealth through the hallway, that same tired backpack slung over her shoulder. Dr. Carter hung back, pretending to review a chart while watching her from the corner of his eye. The fluorescent lights cast strange shadows across her face, making her appear even younger than he'd first thought. The girl slipped into the ward's far corner, moving with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly where they were going. From his position near the nurse's station, he could see her clearly now. She stacked 2 plastic chairs together, a routine she seemed to have perfected. From her backpack came a thin jacket and that same medical book he'd noticed before, its spine cracked and well-worn from repeated reading. His heart sank as he watched her curl up on the makeshift bed, her movements careful and precise. This wasn't a visitor staying late, or a child waiting for a parent. The practiced movements, the backpack, the way she tried to make herself invisible, It all pointed to something else entirely. This young girl was using the hospital as a shelter, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. Dr. Carter's fingers tightened around his clipboard until his knuckles turned white. Every instinct told him to approach her, to find out what circumstances had led a child to sleep in a hospital ward. But experience had taught him that rushing in might only frighten her away. If she was seeking refuge here, there had to be a reason, and he couldn't risk making her situation worse by startling her. He watched as she opened her book, her small face illuminated by the soft overhead lights, dark circles under her eyes visible even from this distance. How many nights had she spent here? How had no one noticed before? The sight of her trying to find comfort in those hard plastic chairs made his chest tight with concern. She couldn't be more than 12 or 13, far too young to be facing whatever hardship had driven her here. Making his final rounds for the evening, Doctor. Carter couldn't shake the image of the girl from his mind. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would approach her carefully and learn her story. For now, he would let her have this safe space she'd carved out for herself, though every step away from her felt like a small betrayal of his duty to help. As he prepared to leave the ward, he took one last look at her corner. She had already drifted off to sleep, the medical book still open on her lap, her chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of exhaustion. Dr. Carter squared his shoulders, his resolution firm. Tomorrow he would find out why this young girl called his pediatric ward home, and he would do whatever it took to help her find a better solution than plastic chairs and borrowed safety. Right on cue, she appeared at the end of the hallway. Dr. Carter watched from the nurse's station as Ruby slipped into the pediatric ward, her small frame moving with practiced stealth. Her footsteps were nearly silent against the polished floor as she made her way to her usual spot. He gave her a few minutes to settle in, pretending to review charts while she went through her nightly routine. The fluorescent lights hummed softly as he made his way toward her corner, casting long shadows across the quiet hallway. Ruby had already stacked her chairs and was deeply absorbed in her book, her worn jacket draped across her shoulders like a blanket. The fabric was frayed at the edges, telling its own story of hard times. "Hello there," Dr. Carter said quietly, keeping his voice gentle like he would with a frightened animal. Ruby's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. The book tumbled from her hands as she scrambled to gather her things, nearly knocking over the chairs in her panic. Her breathing came in quick, shallow bursts. "I'm sorry, I'm waiting for my mom," she stammered, stuffing her belongings into her backpack with trembling hands. A pencil clattered to the floor in her rush. "She's coming to get me soon." "It's okay, Doctor." Carter held up his hands in a calming gesture, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "You're not in trouble. I just want to know why you're here so late every night." Ruby froze, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest like armor. "Like I said, my mom's coming." Her voice was defensive, but Dr. Carter could hear the tremor in it, the slight waver that betrayed her uncertainty. "Are you visiting someone in the hospital?" he asked, maintaining a safe distance to avoid frightening her further. He noticed how she kept glancing between him and the doorway, calculating her escape route. "No, yes. Ruby's eyes darted toward the exit, her fingers fidgeting with the zipper of her backpack. "I should go." Dr. Carter noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her clothes hung loose on her small frame. Her collarbones were too prominent, her cheeks slightly hollow. Something wasn't right. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" he asked softly. "I eat," Ruby said quickly, but her hand unconsciously went to her stomach. A faint growl betrayed her words. "I'm fine, really." "Listen," Dr. Carter said. "I've seen you here the past few nights. If you need help—" "I don't need help," Ruby cut him off, but her voice cracked slightly. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "My mom will be here any minute." Dr. Carter recognized the fear in her eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in many young patients who were scared and trying to be brave. The mix of determination and desperation in her expression tugged at his heart. He decided not to push further tonight. "All right," he said gently. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm usually here in the evenings. My name is Dr. Carter. Ruby nodded quickly, already backing away. She clutched her backpack like a shield as she hurried past him and disappeared into the hallway, her footsteps echoing faster and faster until they faded completely. Dr. Carter watched her go, his heart heavy. Something was clearly wrong, and he was determined to find out what it was. In all his years at the hospital, he'd never seen a child so clearly in need of help, yet so determined to avoid it. Dr. Carter settled into his office chair early the next morning, his coffee growing cold beside his keyboard. The hospital database glowed on his screen as he typed Ruby into the search field, the cursor blinking steadily as he waited for results. No pediatric patients matched her description. He rubbed his tired eyes, thinking about her insistence that she was waiting for her mother, the desperation in her voice echoing in his memory. "Mother," he muttered, switching to the ICU records. His fingers moved across the keyboard, scanning through recent admissions. That's when he saw it. Grace Thompson, hospital janitor, admitted 3 weeks ago after a workplace accident. The name seemed to jump off the screen at him. His stomach tightened as he read through her file, each detail worse than the last. The details painted a grim picture. Grace had slipped in a poorly maintained storage room, hitting her head on a metal shelf. The impact caused severe trauma, leaving her in a coma. What caught his attention next made his heart sink. Multiple maintenance requests about the wet floor had been ignored, each one dated and time-stamped, creating a paper trail of institutional neglect. Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, memories flooding back. He'd seen Grace countless times, mopping floors during night shifts, always with a gentle smile despite the late hours. Sometimes she'd step aside respectfully as he rushed past, that same warm expression on her face. How had he not noticed when she stopped appearing in the halls? The familiar face that had become part of the hospital's nightly rhythm had vanished, and he'd been too busy to realize it. The file mentioned a daughter, Ruby Thompson, age 12. No other emergency contacts were listed, no father, no relatives, no one else to care for the child of a single mother lying unconscious in the ICU. The stark emptiness of that section of the form seemed to mock him. "Oh God," he whispered, understanding hitting him like a physical blow. His hands trembled slightly as the pieces fell into place. Ruby hadn't been visiting someone. She'd been staying close to her mother, alone and afraid, with nowhere else to go. The thought of her spending night after night in the hospital made his throat tight. Guilt gnawed at him, settling deep in his chest. How many times had he walked past Grace without really seeing her? How many nights had Ruby been sleeping on those uncomfortable chairs before he noticed? The system had failed them both. First Grace through negligence, and then Ruby, left to fend for herself in a world that seemed to have forgotten she existed. In his office, Dr. Carter held Grace's file, its pages heavy with the weight of what they revealed. His mind raced with questions about Ruby's situation. Was she going to school? Did she have food? Where was she during the day? The thought of her spending nights alone in the hospital, trying to stay close to her unconscious mother, made his chest ache with a mixture of compassion and regret. He needed to talk to Ruby again, but this time, he'd approach her with understanding rather than suspicion. Now he knew why those eyes had looked so haunted, why she'd been so desperate to avoid attention. The truth of her situation cast every interaction in a new light, and he felt a deep responsibility to help make things right. Dr. Carter found Ruby in her usual corner of the pediatric ward that evening. She was curled up with her book, her small frame nearly disappearing into the makeshift bed of chairs she'd arranged against the wall. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows across her face as he approached slowly, holding a carefully wrapped sandwich from the cafeteria. "I thought you might be hungry," he said softly, extending the sandwich toward her. The smell of fresh bread and turkey wafted between them. Ruby's eyes widened in surprise, her stomach growling traitorously. She glanced between his face and the offered food, her fingers fidgeting with the dog-eared corner of her book. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted the sandwich with trembling hands as if afraid it might disappear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Dr. Carter settled into a chair beside her, giving her space but staying close enough to talk. The vinyl squeaked beneath his weight. "Ruby," he began gently, "I know about your mother, Grace. I found her file this morning." Ruby's shoulders slumped, tension visible in every line of her small body. The sandwich lay unopened in her lap as she stared at the floor, tracing patterns in the worn linoleum with her shoe. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely, jutting out her chin. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice barely audible over the distant beeping of hospital machines. "Dad left us years ago, and Mom, she's all I have. No aunts, no uncles, no grandparents, just us." Dr. Carter nodded, letting her continue at her own pace. The evening light filtering through the windows cast a golden glow around them. "I can't leave her here alone," Ruby went on, her words tumbling out faster now, like a dam breaking. "What if she wakes up and I'm not here? What if something happens?" She wrapped her arms around herself, making herself even smaller. "I've been staying every night since the accident. The security guard changes shifts at 9 p.m., so that's when I sneak in." "What about school?" Dr. Carter asked softly, dreading the answer. Ruby's face flushed with shame, pink spreading across her cheeks. "I stopped going. The teachers would ask questions, and I just couldn't tell them." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge on her sleeve. "I grab food from the cafeteria when nobody's looking. Sometimes the cleaning staff leaves trays outside patient rooms, and Her voice cracked, heavy with embarrassment. Dr. Carter's heart ached as he watched this brave young girl fight back tears. She'd been surviving on her own, carrying this burden alone for weeks, scraping by on leftover hospital food and stolen moments of sleep. "Ruby," he said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling how thin she'd become. "You don't have to do this by yourself anymore. I'm going to help you." For the first time since he'd met her, Ruby's eyes filled with something new. Hope. It transformed her entire face, chasing away the shadows of exhaustion and fear that had aged her beyond her years. The next morning, Dr. Carter stood before the hospital administration board, his hands clasped behind his back. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he explained Ruby's situation to the stern-faced administrators seated around the polished conference table. His heart pounded, knowing how much was riding on this meeting. "This child has been sleeping in our pediatric ward for weeks," he said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "Her mother, Grace Thompson, one of our own janitorial staff, lies in a coma after an accident that happened right here in our hospital. Ruby has no one else, no family to turn to." The hospital administrator, Mrs. Peters, frowned and adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. "While this is certainly concerning, Dr. Carter, the hospital isn't equipped to—" "We have a family suite on the 3rd floor that's been empty for months," Dr. Carter interrupted, taking a step forward. "Ruby needs a safe place to stay, close to her mother. We owe her that much, considering the circumstances of Grace's accident. This is about doing what's right." After much discussion and several meaningful glances between board members, punctuated by whispered conversations, they finally agreed. That evening, Dr. Carter led Ruby down a quiet hallway to the family suite, their footsteps echoing against the tile floor. He unlocked the door and switched on the lights, revealing her new temporary home. Ruby stepped inside, her worn backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes widened as she took in the small but tidy room. A real bed stood against one wall, with fresh sheets and a soft blue blanket that looked cloud-soft. A desk sat beneath a window overlooking the hospital gardens, and a closet waited for the clothes she didn't have. "This is for me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Carter nodded, setting down the takeout containers he'd brought for dinner. The smell of Chinese food filled the room as they sat at the small table, and as they ate, Ruby began to open up, her words spilling out like water from a broken dam. "Dad left when I was 5, she said, pushing rice around her plate with her plastic fork. "Just packed his bags one day and never came back. Mom had to work so many jobs after that." Ruby's voice trembled with the weight of memories. She'd come home so tired, her hands raw from cleaning, but she always made time to help me with homework or read me a story. Dr. Carter listened, his heart heavy as Ruby continued, her shoulders hunched under invisible burdens no child should have to bear. She always told me to stay strong no matter what happened. Ruby's eyes filled with tears that caught the overhead light. But I don't know if I can be strong enough for this. What if she never wakes up? What if... Her voice broke and the tears spilled over, running down her cheeks in silent streams. Dr. Carter felt his own eyes growing wet as he watched this brave little girl's pain. He reached across the table and took Ruby's small hand in his, noting how tiny and cold it felt in his warm grasp. "I miss her so much," Ruby sobbed, her whole body shaking. "I just want my mom back." Dr. Carter wiped his eyes with his free hand, struggling to maintain his composure. "Ruby, I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to help you and your mother. Everything." He squeezed her hand gently, trying to convey all the support and care he couldn't put into words. Ruby nodded, still crying but with a tiny spark of hope in her eyes, even as fear of the unknown clouded her face. Her fingers tightened around his, holding on as if he were an anchor in a storm. The next morning, Dr. Carter walked into the administration meeting with determination written across his face. He carried a folder filled with carefully prepared documents outlining Ruby's needs, each page annotated with specific requirements and potential solutions. "She needs more than just a room," he explained, spreading the papers across the conference table. "Ruby needs proper meals, clothes that fit, and most importantly, she needs to return to school. We're talking about a 12-year-old girl who's been struggling to survive on her own." Mrs. Peters drummed her fingers on the table, her lips pressed into a thin line. "The hospital's resources are limited, Dr. Carter. We have budget constraints to consider." "Grace Thompson was injured while working for us," he reminded them firmly, leaning forward in his chair. "We have a responsibility here. This isn't just about policy, it's about doing what's right." After an hour of intense discussion, the board agreed to provide 3 meals a day from the cafeteria and help with school enrollment. Dr. Carter left the meeting and immediately sent an email to the hospital staff about Ruby's situation, hoping someone might be able to help. The response was immediate and heartwarming. By afternoon, the nurses' station overflowed with donations. Sarah, a pediatric nurse with 3 daughters of her own, brought in 3 bags of gently used clothes that still had tags on them. The cafeteria staff prepared special meals, making sure to include Ruby's favorites after learning she loved chocolate milk and turkey sandwiches. Even the maintenance crew pitched in, collecting school supplies and a bright purple backpack with matching pencil cases. Ruby stood in her family suite, staring at the pile of donations with wide eyes. Her fingers traced the edge of a new notebook, disbelief written across her face. The room was filled with clothes, books, and supplies, more than she'd had in months. "People did this for me?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Carter watched as she carefully picked up each item, her movements hesitant as if everything might disappear. He noticed how she kept glancing at him, checking if it was really okay to accept these gifts, her eyes full of wonder and uncertainty. Later that day, Dr. Carter met with Mr. Williams, the principal of the local middle school. They sat in the principal's office, surrounded by student artwork and achievement certificates, discussing Ruby's situation. "We'll make sure she has everything she needs to catch up," Mr. Williams assured him, signing the enrollment papers with a flourish. "She can start next Monday. Our teachers are already preparing a catch-up plan for her." That evening, Nurse Sarah brought a stack of new clothes to Ruby's room, carefully folded and sorted by type. "I hope these fit," she said kindly, setting them on the bed. "My girls picked them out specially." Ruby touched the soft fabric of a blue sweater, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Dr. Carter visited Ruby several times throughout the day, checking how she was settling in. Each time, he found her organizing her new belongings with careful precision, as if creating order would help make sense of the kindness she was receiving. She had arranged her school supplies on the small desk, lined up her new shoes by the door, and carefully hung every piece of clothing in the closet. "Here," Dr. Carter said, holding out another set of clothes. This time, a warm winter coat and new shoes with purple laces. "These are from the staff in pediatrics. They wanted to make sure you stayed warm." Ruby took the items slowly, her fingers curling around the coat sleeve. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at Dr. Carter, her eyes full of gratitude she couldn't quite express, overwhelmed by the generosity of these strangers who had become her unexpected support system. Dr. Carter arrived early Monday morning, carrying a shoebox with brand new sneakers inside. He knocked gently on Ruby's door, finding her already dressed in clean jeans and a purple sweater from the donations. Her hair was neatly combed and she'd even attempted a simple braid, though a few strands had escaped. "I thought you might need these for school," he said, offering the box. His eyes crinkled warmly at the corners as he watched her reaction. Ruby's eyes widened as she opened it. The sneakers were simple white ones, but to her they looked perfect. Her old ones had holes in the soles, and the laces were frayed beyond repair. "Thank you," she whispered, quickly slipping them on. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tied the crisp white laces. The drive to school was quiet. Ruby clutched her backpack tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Dr. Carter glanced at her occasionally, noticing how she chewed her bottom lip and stared intently out the window at the passing buildings. "It's okay to be nervous," he said softly, "but you're stronger than you know." He reached over and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. At the school office, Principal Matthews greeted them warmly. Ruby sat quietly while Dr. Carter handled the paperwork, answering questions only when directly asked. Her eyes darted around the unfamiliar space, taking everything in: the colorful bulletin boards, the steady hum of phones ringing, and the occasional student hurrying past. Ms. Anderson, a teacher with kind eyes and curly brown hair, appeared to escort Ruby to her first class. "We're so glad to have you join us," she said with a genuine smile that made her whole face light up. In class, Ruby felt the weight of curious stares. Whispers followed her as she found an empty seat near the middle of the room. She kept her head down, focusing on her notebook until science class began, her new sneakers tucked carefully under her desk. The teacher, Mr. Roberts, was discussing the human heart. When he asked a question about ventricles, the room fell silent. Ruby's hand slowly raised, trembling slightly in the quiet classroom. "The right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs while the left ventricle pumps blood to the rest of the body," she answered quietly but confidently, her voice growing stronger with each word. Mr. Roberts looked impressed. "That's exactly right, Ruby. Have you studied this before?" He leaned forward, genuinely interested. She nodded slightly. "I read about it in the hospital library." Her fingers twisted nervously in her sweater, as a few students turned to look at her with newfound curiosity. At lunch, Ruby sat alone until a girl with braids like hers approached. "I'm Jasmine," she said, setting her tray down. "Want to share my cookies?" She pushed forward a small package of chocolate chip cookies with a friendly grin. When the final bell rang, Ruby waited outside, scanning for Dr. Carter's car. She spotted him pulling up and climbed into the passenger seat, the new sneakers squeaking slightly against the floor mat. "How was it?" he asked carefully, studying her expression in the afternoon light. Ruby paused, then gave a small smile. "I knew the answer in science class," she said. "And I made a friend at lunch." Her voice held a hint of pride and relief that hadn't been there that morning. Dr. Carter drummed his fingers on his steering wheel, lost in thought after dropping Ruby at school. Something about Grace's accident kept nagging at him, like a persistent itch he couldn't quite reach. The official report seemed too neat, too simple, wrapped up in bureaucratic language that explained everything and nothing at all. He parked in his usual spot at the hospital and headed straight to HR instead of his office. The department's harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he approached the front desk, their sterile glow matching the institutional beige walls. "I need to see Grace Thompson's employment records and any maintenance reports from the past year," he said to Linda, the HR manager. She looked up from her computer, her practiced smile faltering slightly as she recognized him. "That's quite unusual, Dr. Carter. Those records are confidential." Her hands clasped together defensively on her desk. "I'm aware," he replied firmly, squaring his shoulders. "But as her daughter's current guardian and her attending physician, I have concerns about the circumstances of her accident." Linda hesitated, her fingers hovering over her keyboard like nervous birds. "I'll need to check with legal." Linda, Dr. Carter leaned forward, keeping his voice low but firm. Please, this is important. A woman nearly died. After several tense moments, Linda sighed and retrieved a thick folder from the filing cabinet, its manila edges worn from handling. Give me a moment to pull up the digital maintenance records. Dr. Carter sat at a small table in the corner, spreading out the documents. His frown deepened as he read, each page revealing more troubling details. 3 separate maintenance requests about the storage room floor, all filed by Grace. Each one described the same issue, standing water from a leaking pipe making the floor dangerously slippery. The dates showed a pattern of neglect spanning months. Then he found something that made his blood boil, a written warning in Grace's file dated just 2 weeks before her accident. The reason? Excessive complaints about working conditions. The words seemed to mock him from the page. Linda, he called out, holding up the warning, his hand trembling slightly. Can you explain this? She walked over, glancing at the paper before quickly looking away. Sometimes employees can be overly concerned about minor issues. Minor? Dr. Carter's voice rose slightly, echoing off the sterile walls. She reported a serious safety hazard 3 times. Instead of fixing it, you wrote her up? Do you realize what this means? Linda shifted uncomfortably, her face flushing. Dr. Carter, I really don't think… I need copies of everything, he interrupted, standing up with barely contained fury. Every maintenance request, every response, every note in her file, every single piece of paper that shows how this happened. That's not protocol. Make the copies. Each word came out clipped and sharp like surgical instruments striking metal. 10 minutes later, Dr. Carter walked out of HR with a thick stack of photocopies under his arm. His hands were shaking slightly with anger, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. The hospital's negligence had put a dedicated employee in a coma and left her daughter alone. They had ignored Grace's warnings and then punished her for speaking up, a woman who had only tried to protect herself and others from harm. The weight of the papers felt like evidence of betrayal in his hands. Ruby sat at her small desk, the lamp casting a warm glow over her paper. Her pencil moved slowly across the page as she wrote, each word carefully chosen. Dear Mom, today was my first day at school. I wish you could have seen me in my new clothes. They're so different from my old ones. The teachers are nice, especially my science teacher. She smiled when I knew about the human heart from all those medical books I've been reading. You would have been proud of me, I think. I made it through lunch without crying, which is good. A girl named Sarah even sat with me. She shared her cookie and told me about the science club that meets after school. But I still missed you so much it hurt. Dr. Carter drove me to school and picked me up. He's been really kind, Mom, but he's not you. Ruby's hand trembled slightly as she continued writing, her emotions spilling onto the page. The hospital gave us this little room to stay in. It's clean and quiet, and I don't have to hide anymore. But I'd trade it all just to hear your voice again, to feel you hug me and tell me everything will be okay. Sometimes at night I whisper goodnight to you, hoping somehow you can hear me. She folded the letter carefully and opened her shoebox, where dozens of similar letters lay neatly stacked. Each one held her thoughts, her fears, her hopes, everything she wished she could tell her mother. The paper edges were slightly worn from being read and reread on lonely nights. A gentle knock at the door made Ruby look up. Dr. Carter stood there, holding something behind his back, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Writing to your mom? He asked softly. Ruby nodded, quickly wiping her eyes with her sleeve, embarrassed by her tears. Dr. Carter pulled out a beautiful leather-bound journal with a blue cover, the color of a summer sky. I thought you might like this better than loose papers. Ruby stared at the journal, not reaching for it immediately. Her fingers played with the corner of her latest letter, feeling the familiar texture of the paper she'd been using for weeks. It's okay if you prefer your way, Doctor, Carter said, sitting down beside her. But sometimes having all our thoughts in one place can help us feel more organized, less scattered. I just want her to read them all someday, Ruby whispered, her voice catching on the word someday. Dr. Carter placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're not alone in this, Ruby. I know I'm not your mom, but I'm here." Ruby reached out slowly and took the journal, running her fingers over its smooth cover. The leather felt cool and promising under her touch. "Thank you," she whispered, opening it to the first blank page. She picked up her pencil again and began writing, "Dear Mom, ... The fresh paper felt different under her hand, but somehow it felt right, like a new chapter waiting to be filled. Dr. Carter's footsteps echoed through the hospital's executive floor as he approached the boardroom. His hands clutched the manila folder containing Grace's records, his knuckles white with determination. Sweat beaded at his temples as he walked down the carpeted hallway. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy wooden door. 8 board members sat around a polished table, their faces stern and unwelcoming. The morning sunlight streaming through tall windows cast harsh shadows across their features. Dr. Carter took his seat, spreading the documents before him with practiced precision. "I've uncovered some disturbing information about Grace Thompson's accident," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "There were multiple maintenance requests about that storage room floor, all of them ignored. The paper trail goes back months." Dr. Henderson, the board chairman, leaned forward with a frown, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. "Dr. Carter, this isn't your department. The incident has already been investigated." "Has it?" Dr. Carter slid forward a stack of complaint forms, the papers rustling in the tense silence. "These show a pattern of neglect. Grace reported the hazard 3 times before her fall. She was even reprimanded for being too persistent with her concerns. The dates and signatures are all here." "That's an HR matter," a woman in a gray suit cut in sharply, her manicured fingers drumming against the table. "You're overstepping, Doctor." "Carter, your role is pediatrics, not workplace safety." Dr. Carter felt his face grow hot, his collar suddenly too tight. "A woman is in a coma. Her 12-year-old daughter was left alone for weeks. How is this not everyone's concern? We're supposed to be healers, not bureaucrats." The board members exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Dr. Henderson's voice turned cold as winter. "We understand your attachment to this situation, but pursuing this further would be unwise. Consider this a formal warning. The hospital has procedures for these matters." "Are you threatening my job?" Dr. Carter asked, his voice rising, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "We're reminding you of your place in this institution," Dr. Henderson replied, adjusting his tie with deliberate slowness. "Don't mistake your position here as untouchable. There are protocols to follow." Dr. Carter stood up, gathering his papers with shaking hands. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "So that's it? Sweep it under the rug and hope everyone forgets? Pretend this never happened? That will be all, Doctor." Carter, Dr. Henderson dismissed him with a wave, already turning to his notes. Back in his office, Dr. Carter sank into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His eyes fell on the framed photo on his desk. Dr. William Ross, his mentor from medical school. The old man's kind eyes seemed to look right through him, just as they had when he was a resident, full of idealism and purpose. "Doing the right thing isn't always easy," Dr. Ross had told him once during a particularly challenging case. Those words rang in his ears now, clear as day, carrying the weight of truth. Dr. Carter touched the frame gently, remembering how Dr. Ross had fought for his patients, even when it cost him promotions and privileges. The old doctor had never wavered from his principles, no matter the price. He looked at Grace's file again, thinking of Ruby's brave face as she tried to navigate life without her mother, of her determination to keep going despite everything. The choice was clear. He wouldn't back down even if it meant risking everything he'd worked for. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Ruby's alarm clock beeped softly at 6 in the morning. She sat up in her hospital suite bed, already wide awake with excitement for another school day. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting warm golden patterns on her blanket as she carefully packed her backpack, making sure each notebook and textbook was neatly arranged. She double-checked her homework from the night before, smoothing out any wrinkled pages. Dr. Carter knocked on her door at 7:30, right on schedule. "Ready for school?" he asked with a warm smile, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Ruby nodded, shouldering her backpack. He noticed how she walked taller now, no longer trying to make herself invisible. The scared girl from 2 weeks ago was slowly transforming into someone who held her head high and met people's eyes when they spoke to her. In science class, Ms. Anderson wrote circulatory system on the whiteboard in her neat handwriting. Ruby's hand shot up immediately when the teacher asked about the heart's chambers, nearly bouncing in her seat with eagerness to share what she knew. "The heart has 4 chambers," Ruby explained confidently, her voice clear and steady. "The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from the body, while the left ventricle pumps oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body." She'd learned this from the medical books she'd read during those lonely nights in the pediatric ward, when the quiet halls echoed with nothing but the soft beeping of machines. Ms. Anderson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's exactly right, Ruby. Very impressive." Her smile encouraged Ruby to sit up even straighter in her chair. During group work, Tommy struggled with his worksheet, his forehead wrinkled in confusion. Ruby scooted her chair closer, the legs squeaking against the floor. "Here, let me help. Think of the heart like a house with 4 rooms." Her explanation made Tommy's face light up with understanding, his frustrated frown melting into a grateful smile. At lunch, Emily, a girl with curly red hair and freckles sprinkled across her nose, waved Ruby over to her table. "That was really cool how you explained everything in science class," she said, sharing her chocolate chip cookies with Ruby. The gesture of friendship warmed Ruby more than the cookies themselves. After class, Ms. Anderson called Ruby to her desk. "Ruby, the school science fair is coming up next month. With your knowledge and enthusiasm for anatomy, I think you'd do wonderfully." She handed Ruby a bright blue flyer with all the competition details. Ruby's eyes sparkled at the suggestion, her mind already racing with possibilities. On the drive home, she couldn't contain her excitement, practically bouncing in her seat. "Dr. Carter, I want to make a model of the human heart for the science fair. Could you help me get some materials?" "Of course," he replied, grinning at her enthusiasm as he navigated through the afternoon traffic. "We can pick up supplies tomorrow after school. I know just the craft store." That night, Ruby sat cross-legged on her bed, her new journal open before her. She sketched detailed diagrams of the heart, labeling each part carefully with her favorite mechanical pencil. Her tongue stuck out slightly as she concentrated, erasing and redrawing until each line was perfect. The soft scratching of pencil on paper filled the quiet room as she worked. For the first time since her mother's accident, she felt a spark of joy and purpose in what she was doing, and the future didn't seem quite so scary anymore. Ruby sat in the familiar ICU chair beside her mother's bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the quiet room. She held Grace's hand, noticing how warm it felt compared to those first scary weeks when her fingers had been so cold and lifeless. "Mom, you won't believe what happened in science class today," Ruby said softly, her thumb tracing circles on her mother's palm. "Ms. Anderson says I should enter the science fair. I'm thinking about making a model of the heart. You know, like those diagrams in the books I've been reading. I've already started sketching some ideas." She pulled her backpack closer and took out her journal, its pages worn from daily use. "My grades are getting better too. I got an A on my math test, just like you always said I could if I studied hard enough. All those times you helped me with multiplication tables really paid off." Suddenly, Ruby felt something, a tiny movement against her palm. She froze, hardly daring to breathe, afraid she might have imagined it. There it was again. Grace's fingers twitched ever so slightly, like a butterfly's wing against her skin. "Mom!" Ruby's voice trembled. She pressed the call button with shaking hands, her heart racing so fast she could hear it pounding in her ears. Nurse Sarah rushed in moments later, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the floor. "What's wrong, Ruby?" "Her hand, she moved her hand." Ruby's words tumbled out in a rush. "I felt it, I really did. It wasn't like the other times, this was different." Nurse Sarah checked Grace's vital signs and reflexes, her face growing serious with concentration. The minutes seemed to stretch like hours as she worked. I'll page Dr. Wilson right away. This could be a positive sign. Ruby bolted from the room, her sneakers squeaking against the floor as she ran toward the pediatric ward, dodging around meal carts and visitors. She found Dr. Carter at the nurse's station, signing his last charts for the day. "Dr. Carter," she called out, breathless, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom moved her hand. The nurse is checking on her right now." Dr. Carter immediately set down his papers and followed Ruby back to the ICU. By then, Dr. Wilson was examining Grace, noting readings on various machines while muttering quietly to himself. "There's definitely increased brain activity," Dr. Wilson confirmed, pointing to one of the monitors. "These are encouraging signs." Over the next hour, the ICU staff monitored Grace closely, coming and going with quiet efficiency. Ruby refused to leave her mother's side, holding her hand and talking continuously, her voice growing hoarse, but never stopping. "Remember when you taught me to make your special pancakes?" Ruby said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been practicing. When you wake up, I'll make them for you every morning. I even remembered the secret ingredient, that pinch of cinnamon you always add." She pulled out all the letters she'd written, stored safely in her journal, the pages crinkled from being read and reread. "I want to read these to you, Mom. I wrote about everything. School, my new friend Emily, the science fair. I didn't want you to miss anything important." Dr. Carter stood nearby, watching Ruby with pride and cautious hope. His years of experience had taught him that recovery from a coma was complex and unpredictable, but seeing Ruby's unwavering faith touched his heart deeply. Later that evening, Ruby carefully folded a new letter she'd just written, smoothing out the creases with trembling fingers. Her words were different this time, full of hope instead of fear, brimming with possibilities rather than worry. She tucked the paper gently into her mother's hand, wrapping Grace's warm fingers around it. "You'll wake up soon, Mom," she whispered, leaning close to kiss her mother's cheek. "I just know it." Dr. Carter straightened his tie and smoothed down his white coat before entering the hospital boardroom. The familiar faces around the polished oak table turned to watch him, their expressions guarded and cold. A heavy silence filled the room as he placed his stack of files deliberately in front of him, the sound of papers shuffling echoing in the tense atmosphere. "I've brought updated reports from the ICU regarding Grace Thompson's condition," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. His fingers traced the edge of the topmost file. "The medical documentation clearly shows her injury could have been prevented with proper maintenance. The evidence is substantial." Board Chairman Davidson leaned forward, his jaw tight, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. "Dr. Carter, we've been through this. The accident was unfortunate, but—" "With all due respect," Dr. Carter interrupted, sliding forward a thick folder filled with highlighted documents and sticky notes. "These maintenance logs show repeated requests for repairs. The wet floor that caused Mrs. Thompson's fall had been reported 6 times in the 3 months before her accident. 6 times, and nothing was done." "You're overstepping, Doctor." Carter, Ms. Reynolds, the hospital's legal counsel, cut in sharply, her manicured fingers drumming against the table. "This isn't your department, and frankly, your interference is becoming disruptive to hospital operations." Dr. Carter opened another file, spreading out papers marked with yellow highlighter. "I have testimonies from 3 other janitorial staff members about unsafe working conditions. They were all afraid to speak up after seeing what happened to Grace. These are their signed statements." Chairman Davidson's face reddened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "This is your final warning, Doctor. Carter, your actions are damaging hospital morale and creating unnecessary tension among the staff. One more step out of line and you'll face suspension. Is that clear?" The threat hung heavy in the air like storm clouds before rain. Dr. Carter's hands clenched under the table, but his voice remained calm, measured. "Are you more concerned about morale or covering up negligence? Because from where I'm sitting, the pattern is clear." "That's enough." Davidson slammed his hand on the table, making water glasses rattle. "You're dismissed, Dr. Carter. And consider this your formal warning. Any further pursuit of this matter will result in immediate disciplinary action. We're done here." As he gathered his files with trembling fingers, Dr. Carter's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his old mentor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, now working at the state medical board, lit up the screen. Got your message. Let's talk about options. Walking out of the boardroom, Dr. Carter clutched the files to his chest like armor. The evidence was clear, the injustice obvious. He thought of Ruby's hopeful face as she sat by her mother's bedside, reading her school books aloud, and of Grace lying unconscious because of preventable negligence that no one wanted to acknowledge. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick response to Dr. Martinez, his jaw set with determination. Yes, I need your help. This isn't right, and they need to be held accountable. There's a 12-year-old girl who deserves better. Ruby sat in her math class, working through a problem set about fractions and decimals, when the school secretary appeared at the door. Mrs. Jenkins's face was tight with concern as she beckoned Ruby outside, her fingers nervously adjusting her reading glasses. "Honey, there's a call from the hospital. They say it's urgent." The secretary's voice was gentle but strained. Ruby's heart dropped like a stone as she followed the secretary to the office, her worksheet forgotten on her desk. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the receiver as she picked up the phone. "Hello?" Her voice came out small and scared, barely above a whisper. "Ruby, this is Nurse Martinez from the ICU. You need to come to the hospital right away. There's been a change in your mother's condition." The nurse's professional tone couldn't hide the urgency underneath. The world seemed to tilt sideways, colors and sounds blending together. Ruby barely remembered gathering her things or the taxi ride Dr. Carter had arranged. Everything blurred into a fog of fear until she saw him waiting at the hospital entrance, his face grave and his shoulders tense. Ruby. He wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders as she ran to him, nearly tripping over her own feet. "Your mother's condition has deteriorated suddenly. There's pressure building in her brain, and she needs emergency surgery." "No," Ruby whispered, her fingers digging into Dr. Carter's crisp white coat. "She was getting better. You said she was getting better. Her tests were improving." "I know, sweetheart." His voice cracked with emotion. "Sometimes these things happen with brain injuries. The surgical team is preparing now. We caught it early, which gives us a better chance." In the consultation room, the neurosurgeon explained the procedure with diagrams Ruby could barely focus on, her eyes blurring with unshed tears. Her mother needed immediate surgery to relieve the pressure, but the operation was risky and expensive, more money than Ruby had ever imagined. "The hospital will only cover 60% of the costs," the surgeon said carefully, shuffling the papers on his desk. Given Mrs. Thompson's employment status and the circumstances of her injury, Ruby felt the room spinning, her breath coming in short gasps. "But we don't have any money. We never had much savings, and Mom's been in here so long. We've already used everything we had." Dr. Carter's face darkened with anger, his jaw clenching. "This is ridiculous. The hospital caused her injury in the first place. She came in for a routine procedure." But the surgeon could only shake his head sympathetically, his hands spread wide in helplessness. Hospital policy was firm, regardless of circumstances. Ruby sank into a waiting room chair, clutching her worn journal to her chest like a shield. The letters she'd written to her mother were tucked inside. All her hopes, dreams, and fears poured onto paper in her neat handwriting. Now they felt hollow and meaningless in the face of possibly losing her mother forever. She bowed her head, hot tears falling onto the journal's faded blue cover. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. "Please don't take her away from me. I need her." Ruby sat at her small desk, the desk lamp casting a warm glow over scattered pages filled with tear-stained words. Her usual nightly letters to her mother lay strewn about, each one a testament to her unwavering love and hope. But tonight's task felt different, heavier. The weight of what she needed to say pressed down on her shoulders as she picked up her pen, hands shaking slightly as she began to write to the hospital board. "Dear hospital board members," she started, then paused, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to tell them. Dr. Carter sat nearby in a worn hospital chair, offering gentle encouragement with his steady presence. "Just write from your heart, Ruby. Tell them your story. Sometimes the simplest truth is the most powerful." Ruby took a deep breath, drawing strength from his words, and continued writing. My name is Ruby Thompson. I'm 12 years old, and my mother, Grace Thompson, is dying because of an accident that could have been prevented. The words felt like stones dropping onto the paper. Her pen moved faster now, words flowing onto the page as if they'd been waiting to break free. She described how her mother worked late nights keeping the hospital clean, proud of her job despite the low pay and long hours. She wrote about the wet floor that had been reported multiple times but never fixed, about the sickening moment she learned her mother had fallen and hit her head. Her handwriting grew more urgent with each sentence. "I spent weeks sleeping in the pediatric ward," she wrote, her letters pressing deep into the paper, "because I was too scared to be alone at home. I didn't have anyone else. Mom is all I have. She's my whole world." Dr. Carter watched as Ruby wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, careful not to let them fall on the paper. She described the pain of seeing her mother lying motionless in the ICU bed, of spending countless hours reading medical books to understand what was happening to her, of writing letters her mother couldn't read, but that Ruby hoped somehow reached her heart. "The nurses and doctors here have been so kind to me," she continued, her writing growing steadier. "They've given me clothes, food, and a place to stay when I had nowhere else to go. But my mother is still dying, and she needs surgery that we can't afford. The same hospital where she worked so hard keeping floors clean and rooms safe for patients won't help save her life." Ruby paused, her pen hovering above the paper as she looked up at Dr. Carter, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Should I tell them about wanting to be a doctor?" He nodded encouragingly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's important, Ruby. Let them see your dreams. Show them the future they could help create." She bent over the paper again, determination renewed. "I want to be a doctor someday. I want to help people like my mom, who work hard but get forgotten. I want to make sure no other kid has to write a letter like this one. Please don't let my mother die because we can't afford the surgery. Please help us." Dr. Carter helped her edit the letter, suggesting clearer words here and there, but keeping Ruby's honest, heartfelt voice intact. Each revision made the message stronger while preserving its raw emotion. When they finished, Ruby signed her name at the bottom with careful determination, each letter a promise to her mother. As Dr. Carter folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, handling it as carefully as if it contained precious gems, Ruby looked up at him anxiously, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "Do you think they'll listen?" Dr. Carter knelt down beside her chair, meeting her eyes with the same steady kindness that had helped her through so many difficult nights. "They have to. Some stories demand to be heard, Ruby, and yours is one of them." Dr. Carter straightened his tie and took a deep breath before entering the hospital boardroom. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table, where 12 board members sat in expensive leather chairs. His footsteps echoed in the quiet room as he approached, Ruby's letter feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in his hand. The familiar scent of coffee and sanitizer hung in the air, a reminder of countless other meetings where decisions about people's lives were made in this very room. "Thank you for meeting with me," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I have something I'd like to share with you." His fingers brushed against the worn edges of the paper, evidence of how many times Ruby had folded and unfolded it while writing. He unfolded Ruby's letter, the paper crinkling in the silence. As he read Ruby's words aloud, her voice seemed to fill the room. She described nights spent alone, scared and hungry, sneaking through hospital corridors just to be near her mother. She wrote about Grace's dedication to her job, working late hours to give Ruby a better life. The raw honesty in her words made them impossible to ignore, each sentence a testament to both her pain and her strength. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Stevens, the youngest member, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. But others, like Chairman Williams, maintained stern expressions, their faces masks of professional detachment. The contrast between their reactions was stark, compassion warring with cold practicality. "This child," Dr. Carter said, his voice thick with emotion, "has shown more courage than anyone I've ever met. Her mother's accident was preventable. We failed Grace Thompson. But we don't have to fail her daughter, too. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. Dr. Stevens cleared her throat. We have a moral obligation here. This isn't just about money. It's about doing what's right. She leaned forward, her earnest expression challenging her colleagues to disagree. We can't make decisions based on emotional appeals, Chairman Williams countered, shuffling papers on the table. There are protocols, budgets to consider. If we make an exception here, his gold pen tapped rhythmically against the polished wood. An exception, Dr. Carter interrupted, his frustration breaking through. Grace Thompson was injured because this hospital ignored basic safety protocols. Ruby is 12 years old, sleeping in a hospital suite because she has nowhere else to go. This isn't about making an exception. It's about taking responsibility. The words came out sharp and clear, cutting through the bureaucratic haze. The room fell silent. Board members exchanged glances, some guilty, others calculating. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, as tangible as the morning sunlight. Finally, Dr. Patel, the head of surgery, spoke up. Perhaps we should take some time to review the financial implications. We could reconvene this afternoon for a vote. His voice was measured, diplomatic, trying to bridge the divide. Grace Thompson doesn't have time, Dr. Carter pressed. She needs this surgery now. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Chairman Williams adjusted his glasses. We'll meet again at 4 o'clock to vote. That's the best we can do, Dr. Carter. His tone suggested the discussion was over. Dr. Carter gathered Ruby's letter, his hands trembling slightly with contained anger. As he walked toward the door, he turned back one last time. Just remember, while you're discussing budgets and protocols, there's a 12-year-old girl praying she won't lose her mother. The words hung in the air like an indictment. He left the boardroom, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft click. The morning sun still streamed through the windows, but somehow the light felt colder now. In the corridor, the distant sounds of hospital life continued, a stark reminder of the real people whose lives hung in the balance of boardroom decisions. Dr. Carter stood in the crowded staff lounge surrounded by nurses, doctors, and other hospital workers during their lunch break. The small room buzzed with determination as people sat on chairs, leaned against walls, and even perched on countertops. The aroma of coffee and microwaved lunches filled the air, but nobody seemed focused on eating. We need to show the board this isn't just about one case, Sarah, a veteran nurse, said firmly. Grace was one of us. She kept these halls clean and safe for years. She deserved better than what happened to her. Dr. Carter nodded, watching as people scribbled their names on a petition that Jenny from Pediatrics had drafted. The words at the top were clear and bold. We demand justice for Grace Thompson. The pages were filling up quickly, signatures cramming into every available space. I worked the night shift with Grace for 3 years. Miguel, a maintenance worker, spoke up. His voice trembled slightly. She never complained, even when her back was hurting. Always had a smile, always asked about my kids. She even remembered their birthdays. Others joined in, sharing stories about Grace's dedication, how she stayed late during flu season to sanitize extra thoroughly, how she helped guide visitors who were lost, even though it wasn't her job, how she proudly showed everyone photos of Ruby's school achievements, her face lighting up with joy every time she talked about her daughter. I have an idea, Lisa, a nurse from the ICU, said. She pulled out colorful construction paper from her bag. Let's make a bulletin board. Show everyone who Grace really is. Make them see the person behind the incident report. The staff worked through their breaks, creating a beautiful display in the main hallway. They pinned up Ruby's heartfelt letters, found old staff photos showing Grace's warm smile, and added their own messages of support. We stand with Grace. Our hospital family needs healing. Justice for our essential workers. Someone had drawn hearts and stars around the borders, making the display pop with color and warmth. Jenny arrived with a box of small blue pins. Written in white letters were the words, Justice for Grace. People immediately started attaching them to their scrubs and lab coats, the tiny symbols of solidarity spreading throughout the hospital like ripples in a pond. You should all know, Dr. Carter warned, looking around at his colleagues. This could get us in trouble with administration. They might not take kindly to this kind of protest." Sarah straightened her pin proudly, squaring her shoulders. "Let them try. We're stronger together. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, no matter the consequences." Later that afternoon, Ruby walked through the hospital hallway, her backpack heavy with homework. She stopped suddenly, her eyes widening as she noticed the bulletin board. Her own words stared back at her, surrounded by photos of her mother's smiling face. All around her, hospital staff hurried past wearing small blue pins, the afternoon sun catching on the metal and making them sparkle. Ruby reached out, touching one of the photos of her mother. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the messages of support, finally understanding that she and her mother weren't alone in this fight anymore. Each pin, each signature, each heartfelt message was a reminder that people cared, that they saw her mother as more than just another incident report gathering dust in a filing cabinet. The hospital boardroom felt suffocating as Dr. Carter sat rigid in his chair, watching board members file in one by one. His knuckles were white under the table, and he could hear his heart pounding in his ears. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, making the room feel even more somber. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo his racing pulse. "Let's begin the vote regarding Grace Thompson's surgery," the board chairman announced, his voice echoing in the tense silence. He shuffled the papers in front of him, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Dr. Peterson, a senior board member with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stood up first. "This is fiscally irresponsible. We can't set a precedent of covering extraordinary costs for every employee accident. The budget simply won't allow it." "With all due respect," Dr. Rodriguez interrupted, her voice firm and passionate as she leaned forward in her chair. "This isn't just about money. We failed this woman. We ignored maintenance requests that could have prevented this entire situation. 3 of them, to be exact." The debate grew heated. Voices rose and fell as board members argued back and forth, some pounding their fists on the table for emphasis. Dr. Carter watched, his stomach in knots, as they seemed evenly split between those supporting the surgery and those against it. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Finally, he couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood up, Ruby's letter trembling slightly in his hands, the paper worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. "Before you make your final decision, I want to remind you of something. This letter isn't just words on paper, it's the voice of a 12-year-old girl who's been sleeping in our hospital, afraid of losing her mother. If we turn our backs on them now, what does that say about who we are, about what we stand for?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the CEO, Dr. Harrison, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, her expression unreadable. She looked down at her folded hands, then slowly stood up, smoothing her blazer as she rose. "I've been watching this situation unfold," she said carefully, her words measured and deliberate. "I've seen our staff rally together. I've seen the petition, the bulletin board, the quiet protest of those pins, and I've read Ruby's letter 3 times. She paused, looking around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "We will approve the surgery." Several board members started to protest, but Dr. Harrison held up her hand, her authority clear in the gesture. "This isn't just about one surgery. This is about acknowledging our mistakes and doing what's right. The decision is final. We'll find room in the budget." Dr. Carter felt his shoulders sag with relief, the tension draining from his body like water. He barely heard the rest of the meeting, his mind already racing to tell Ruby the news. His hand shook slightly as he gathered his papers. He found her in the waiting room, curled up in a chair with her journal clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked so small and vulnerable, her sneakers scuffed and her hair falling out of its messy ponytail. Dr. Carter knelt down in front of her chair, his own eyes misty with emotion. "They said yes," he told her softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruby's face crumpled and she launched herself forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. Her tears soaked into his white coat as she cried, but these were different tears. Tears of relief, of hope, of possibility. She held onto him like an anchor in a storm that was finally beginning to calm. Ruby stood in the stark hospital hallway, her fingers wrapped tightly around her journal, its worn cover smooth beneath her touch. The morning light filtered through nearby windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor that squeaked beneath her sneakers. Her heart felt like it might burst from her chest as she watched the medical team preparing for her mother's surgery, their voices low and professional as they consulted their charts. Dr. Carter appeared beside her, his familiar presence bringing a small measure of comfort in the sterile environment. He knelt down, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he met her gaze with a gentle smile. "Ruby, I want you to know something. The surgical team working on your mother today, they're the very best we have. Dr. Williams has done this procedure hundreds of times. She's in good hands." Ruby nodded, unable to find her voice past the lump in her throat. She followed the nurses into her mother's room, where Grace lay still and pale against the white sheets, her dark hair spread across the pillow like a fan. Taking her mother's hand, noting how warm it felt despite everything, Ruby leaned close to her ear. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're going to be okay. You have to be okay. I need you to fight really hard today. Remember how you always told me Thompsons never give up?" She squeezed Grace's hand, willing her mother to squeeze back, to give her any sign she'd heard. When the nurses came to take Grace to surgery, their movements efficient but gentle, Ruby's fingers lingered on her mother's hand until the last possible moment. As they wheeled the bed away, the wheels making a soft humming sound against the floor, Dr. Carter placed a steady hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the waiting room with its rows of uncomfortable chairs. "Dr. Carter?" Ruby's voice was small as they sat down, the plastic chairs creaking beneath them. "Could I have done something? To stop Mom from getting hurt, I mean? Maybe if I had visited her at work more, or helped her more at home?" "No, Ruby." Dr. Carter's voice was firm but kind, his eyes serious behind his glasses. "None of this was your fault. You've been incredibly brave through all of this. Your mother would be so proud of how strong you've been. She talks about you all the time, you know." The hours crawled by like molasses. Ruby opened her journal, its pages dog-eared and well-loved, reading through her letters one by one. Tears splashed onto the pages as she remembered writing each one, hoping her mother would wake up to read them. Some of the ink smudged under her tears, but she kept reading, holding on to every word she'd written, every memory she'd captured in her neat handwriting. Dr. Carter stayed beside her, occasionally getting up to bring her water or a snack from the vending machine down the hall. As they waited, he shared a story that made Ruby look up from her journal, her attention caught by the personal tone in his voice. "You know, when I was about your age, my mother got very sick," he said softly, his hands clasped in his lap. "She was in the hospital for months, but she never gave up. Watching her fight so hard, that's what made me want to become a doctor. I wanted to help other families the way the doctors helped mine. Sometimes the hardest moments in our lives show us our true path." Ruby listened intently, clutching her journal to her chest like a shield. Before she could respond, the door opened with a soft click. The head surgeon walked in, still wearing her surgical cap, wisps of gray hair escaping around the edges. Despite looking exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, she wore a warm smile that made Ruby's heart skip a beat. "The surgery was a success," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of good news. Ruby burst into tears, falling into Dr. Carter's embrace. All the fear and worry she'd been holding inside came pouring out as she sobbed against his white coat, leaving damp spots on the fabric as she was overwhelmed with relief. The tension of the past hours melted away, replaced by a surge of hope so strong it made her dizzy. The ICU room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Ruby sat in the chair next to her mother's bed, holding Grace's hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The surgery had left Grace looking even more fragile, with new bandages wrapped carefully around her head. Dr. Carter appeared in the doorway every few hours, checking Grace's vitals and making notes on his clipboard. His presence had become a comfort to Ruby, like a guardian angel watching over them both. "The surgery went well," he explained softly to Ruby. "Her brain pressure is back to normal. Now we just need to give her time to heal." Over the next few days, Ruby settled into a new routine. She'd go to school, rushed back to the hospital, and spent her evenings by her mother's side. The nurses brought her dinner trays and extra blankets, treating her like one of their own. "Your mom's getting stronger," a kind nurse named Sarah told her. "See how steady her breathing is now?" Ruby noticed other small changes too. Sometimes Grace's fingers would twitch, or her eyelids would flutter. Each tiny movement felt like a miracle. One evening, Ruby pulled out her journal and began reading her latest letter. "Dear Mom," she started, her voice clear in the quiet room. "I got an A on my science test today. Ms. Anderson said my diagram of the heart was the best in class. I think all those medical books I read while waiting for you helped." Dr. Carter had encouraged her to keep talking to Grace. "Patients in comas can often hear their loved ones," he'd explained. "Your voice might help guide her back to us." Ruby continued reading, sharing stories about school and her new friend Emily. She told her mother about the hospital staff wearing Justice for Grace pins and how Dr. Carter had fought for her surgery. As she read, Ruby felt something. The slightest pressure against her palm. Her mother's fingers had moved, squeezing her hand ever so gently. Ruby's heart leaped into her throat. "Mom," she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "Can you hear me?" The morning sunlight filtered through the ICU window, casting a gentle glow across the room. Ruby had fallen asleep in her usual chair, her journal clutched to her chest. The quiet beeping of monitors filled the air. "Ruby?" The voice was barely a whisper, but it jolted Ruby awake instantly. Her eyes flew open to find her mother looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time in months. "Mom!" Ruby jumped up, tears already streaming down her face. She wrapped her arms carefully around her mother, mindful of the tubes and wires. "You're awake! You're really awake!" Grace's arms were weak, but she managed to return the hug. "My baby girl," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "How long?" "Almost 3 months," Ruby said, wiping her eyes. "I was so scared, Mom." Dr. Carter walked in just then, his face breaking into a warm smile at the scene before him. "Welcome back, Mrs. Thompson," he said, moving to check her vitals. Grace looked confused but grateful. "The storage room, I remember falling." "You're safe now," Ruby assured her. "Dr. Carter helped me. He made sure I had a place to stay here at the hospital, and he got me back in school." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Dr. Carter. "You took care of my daughter?" Her voice trembled. "Thank you. I don't know how to—" "Your daughter is an extraordinary young lady," Dr. Carter replied warmly. "She never gave up on you." Ruby reached for her journal. "Mom, I wrote you letters every day. Can I read some to you?" Grace nodded weakly, and Ruby began to read. As she shared stories about school, her new friends, and her hopes for their future, Grace listened intently. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she heard about everything her daughter had been through. After a while, Grace's eyes began to droop with exhaustion. Ruby squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "Everything's going to be okay now, Mom." Dr. Carter sat in his office, staring at the stack of documents on his desk. Maintenance reports, safety complaints, and Grace's medical records. Evidence of the hospital's negligence that had nearly cost a mother her life. With determination, he picked up his phone and dialed the number for Sarah Chen, a respected investigative journalist at the local newspaper. "There's a story you need to hear," he said quietly. Over coffee at a nearby diner, Dr. Carter shared everything with Sarah: the ignored maintenance requests, the unsafe working conditions, and Grace's devastating accident. He showed her Ruby's letters and explained how the hospital board initially refused to fund the life-saving surgery. "This isn't just about one janitor," he explained. "It's about a system that treats its most vulnerable workers as disposable." A week later, Sarah's article appeared on the front page of the Sunday paper. "Hospital's negligence nearly costs mother her life. A story of systemic failure and a daughter's love." The story spread like wildfire through social media and local news channels. Within days, protesters gathered outside the hospital, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Grace" and "Protect our workers." Community leaders demanded accountability, and former employees came forward with their own stories of unsafe conditions. The hospital board called an emergency meeting. Dr. Carter watched from his office window as news vans gathered in the parking lot. By evening, the board announced sweeping changes, new safety protocols, mandatory equipment upgrades, and increased funding for staff training. "We acknowledge our past failures," the hospital's CEO stated at a press conference. "Grace Thompson's story has opened our eyes to the changes needed in our institution." In the maintenance department, workers began installing new safety equipment. Warning signs went up, and fresh non-slip mats appeared in storage rooms. The janitorial staff received new training and proper safety gear. Dr. Carter stood in the hallway watching as maintenance crews installed better lighting and security cameras. A passing nurse wore one of the Justice for Grace pins that had become a symbol of change throughout the hospital. Grace's story had done more than save one life. It had sparked a transformation that would protect countless others. As Dr. Carter headed to check on his patients, he felt the weight of the past months lifting from his shoulders. Sometimes he realized doing the right thing meant fighting not just for one person, but for everyone who might follow in their footsteps. Chapter 25. Grace's Recovery. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window as Grace Thompson opened her eyes to her first full day of consciousness. The familiar beeping of monitors filled the room, but now they seemed less threatening. Ruby sat beside her, carefully holding a bowl of warm chicken broth. "Small sips, Mom," Ruby said softly, bringing the spoon to her mother's lips. Grace's hands trembled as she tried to reach for the spoon herself, but Ruby gently stopped her. "Let me help you." Dr. Carter walked in, holding a manila folder and wearing a warm smile. "Good morning, Thompson ladies," he said, checking the monitors. "Grace, your latest tests show remarkable improvement. Your brain activity is stabilizing and your vital signs are getting stronger every day." Grace managed a weak nod, grateful for the good news. Later that morning, a physical therapist arrived with a set of simple exercises. Grace's frustration showed on her face as she struggled to make her fingers curl around a stress ball. Sweat beaded on her forehead from the effort. "I can't," Grace whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, you can, Mom," Ruby encouraged, demonstrating the movement. "Remember how you taught me to never give up? Just like that time I couldn't solve my math homework?" Dr. Carter observed from the doorway, making notes on his clipboard. "Grace, recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. Every small movement is progress." During a rest period, Grace looked at Ruby with pain in her eyes. "Baby, I'm so sorry. All those weeks you were alone." "Don't, Mom," Ruby interrupted, taking her mother's hand. "I wasn't alone. Dr. Carter helped me, and now everything's getting better. We're together again. That's all that matters." Throughout the day, nurses and staff members stopped by Grace's room. Some brought small gifts, a hand-drawn card from the pediatric ward staff, fresh flowers from the cafeteria workers. Each visitor shared words of encouragement, creating a warm atmosphere of support. By afternoon, Grace had managed to curl her fingers completely around the stress ball. The physical therapist beamed with pride. "Excellent progress, Mrs. Thompson." Later, with the help of a walker and 2 nurses, Grace took her first tentative steps. Her legs shook with the effort, but determination showed in every movement. Ruby watched from a few feet away, her face glowing with pride. "You're the strongest person I know, Mom," Ruby called out encouragingly. Grace looked up at her daughter and, for the first time since waking up, a genuine smile spread across her face. The simple gesture transformed her tired features, bringing back a glimpse of the strong woman Ruby remembered. Ruby sat at her desk in the hospital suite, surrounded by cardboard, paint, and medical diagrams. Her fingers worked carefully, shaping the chambers of her model heart with precision. Dr. Carter had helped her gather everything she needed: red and blue paint to show blood flow, clear tubes to represent arteries, and even some medical-grade clay for detailed features. "Just a few more touches," she mumbled to herself, adding labels to each part. The clock showed 11:30 p.m., but she couldn't sleep. Tomorrow was the science fair, and everything had to be perfect. When morning came, Dr. Carter wheeled Grace through the hospital corridors. She fidgeted with her hospital gown, now covered by a pretty sweater the nurses had given her. "I don't know if I'm ready for all those people," Grace whispered, her hands trembling slightly. "Mom, you look beautiful," Ruby assured her, carrying her project carefully. "And wait until you see what I made." At the school gymnasium, tables lined the walls with various student projects. Ruby set up her display, arranging her model heart and information cards just so. Dr. Carter helped position Grace's wheelchair in the front row. When it was Ruby's turn to present, she stood tall beside her project. "The human heart," she began, her voice clear and confident, "is an amazing muscle that never stops working. It pumps blood through our whole body, keeping us alive." She demonstrated how blood flowed through each chamber, using the tubes she'd carefully painted red and blue. When something goes wrong with the heart, doctors have to work quickly to fix it, just like they did for my mom. Ruby's eyes met Grace's as she continued. "I learned about the heart while reading medical books in the hospital, waiting for my mother to wake up from a coma. Dr. Carter, my mom's doctor, helped me understand everything I was reading. He showed me that medicine isn't just about science, it's about caring for people when they need it most." The judges nodded appreciatively, taking notes as Ruby explained each part of her model in detail. When they announced the winners, Ruby's name echoed through the gymnasium for first place. Clutching her blue ribbon, Ruby rushed to her mother's side. "This is for you, Mom," she said, tears in her eyes. "And for you too, Dr. Carter. You both taught me what it means to have heart." Grace pulled Ruby close, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always been my heart," she whispered, holding her daughter's hand tightly as applause filled the room. Dr. Carter sat in his dimly lit office, the clock on the wall ticking past midnight. Scattered across his desk were papers detailing the hospital's new safety protocols, improved maintenance schedules, mandatory safety checks, and better working conditions for janitorial staff. His fingers traced over the words, remembering how it all started with one little girl sneaking into the pediatric ward. He opened a worn folder containing Ruby's original letters to her mother, which Grace had given him copies of as a thank you. Each page reminded him of Ruby's strength and determination. "Sometimes it takes a child to show us what really matters," he whispered to himself. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the CEO's office windows as Dr. Carter sat across from her desk. His hands were steady as he made his announcement. "I'm resigning," he said firmly. "I'm starting a non-profit clinic for families who can't afford proper medical care." The CEO leaned back in her chair, surprise evident on her face. After a moment, she smiled. "You know, Michael, after everything that happened with Ruby and Grace, I had a feeling you might do something like this. You have my full support." Later that day, Dr. Carter found Ruby and Grace in the hospital garden, where Grace was practicing her walking exercises. His eyes lit up as he shared his plans for the clinic. "I want to help other families who are struggling," he explained. "No child should have to go through what you did, Ruby." Ruby's face brightened. "Could I help sometimes?" "When I'm older?" she asked eagerly. "I want to be just like you, helping people who need it most." Grace squeezed her daughter's hand, tears of pride in her eyes. Over the next few days, Dr. Carter began the difficult process of saying goodbye. He carefully transferred his patients to trusted colleagues, explaining his decision to each family. Many cried, but all understood his calling to help those most in need. On his final evening, Dr. Carter took a slow walk through the pediatric ward. He paused at the corner where he'd first discovered Ruby reading her medical book. The chairs she'd used as a makeshift bed were long gone, but the memory remained vivid. Each step through the familiar hallway brought back moments of both heartbreak and healing. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, a gift from one of the hospital nurses, as Ruby and Dr. Carter helped Grace move into their new apartment. Grace leaned on her walker, taking in the modest but welcoming space. Boxes of donations lined the walls, kitchenware, blankets, and even some framed artwork to make the place feel like home. "It's perfect," Grace whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she looked around the living room. The couch was secondhand but clean, adorned with colorful throw pillows from the pediatric ward staff. Ruby bounced from room to room, arranging her mother's belongings with careful attention. "Look, Mom, Ms. Anderson helped me set up your bedroom, and the kitchen has everything we need." The transition wasn't easy. Grace often found herself overwhelmed by simple tasks. Making breakfast or folding laundry would leave her exhausted. Her hands sometimes trembled when reaching for objects, a lingering effect of her long hospital stay. But Ruby was always there, moving with quiet efficiency through their morning routine. She'd wake up early to prepare breakfast, pack her school lunch, and help her mother with her exercises before heading to class. After school, she'd tackle homework at the kitchen table while keeping an eye on Grace. Dr. Carter visited regularly, bringing groceries and checking on Grace's recovery. One evening, he found Grace struggling with a pile of medical bills. "I don't know how to thank everyone," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "The community, the hospital staff, you." "You already have, Doctor," Carter replied gently. "Your story has changed so many lives for the better." During dinner one night, Grace watched Ruby solving complex math problems while stirring pasta sauce on the stove. "You know," Grace said softly, "you'd make an amazing doctor someday." Ruby's eyes lit up. "Really? You think I could? With your heart and determination? There's nothing you can't do, baby girl." That night, Grace slowly made her way to Ruby's bedroom, each step careful but determined. Ruby was already in bed, writing in her journal, the same one Dr. Carter had given her months ago. Grace lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, running her fingers through Ruby's braids. The simple act of tucking her daughter in, something she'd missed for so long, filled her heart with joy. "Thank you for being my strength," Grace whispered, leaning down to kiss Ruby's forehead. Ruby smiled up at her mother, contentment radiating from her face. Finally, they were home, together, and healing. The warm glow of their apartment's table lamp cast soft shadows as Ruby and Grace sat together on their worn couch. Ruby's journal lay open between them, its pages filled with months of letters, hopes, and fears. "Listen to this one, Mom," Ruby said, pointing to a tear-stained page. "I wrote this the night before your surgery." Her voice trembled slightly as she read about her fears of losing her mother and her gratitude for Dr. Carter's help. Grace wrapped an arm around Ruby's shoulders. "Dr. Carter is a remarkable man. He saw something special in you, baby." Ruby traced her fingers over the words. "He made me believe I could be anything, even..." She hesitated, then continued, "Even a doctor someday." "And you can be," Grace said firmly. "I've seen how hard you study, how much you care about helping others. That's what makes a great doctor." The next day at school, Ruby approached Ms. Anderson with an idea that had been forming in her mind. "Could we organize a bake sale to help Dr. Carter's new clinic?" she asked. "He's done so much for me and Mom." Ms. Anderson's face lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Ruby. We could make it a whole class project." Word spread quickly through the school. Ruby stood in front of her class, sharing her story about Dr. Carter's kindness. Many students were moved to tears, immediately offering to help. At home, Grace insisted on contributing despite her still shaky hands. "I can at least make my famous chocolate chip cookies," she said, carefully measuring ingredients while Ruby supervised. The morning of the bake sale, tables lined the school hallway, loaded with homemade treats. Students, teachers, and parents gathered around as Ruby told her story again and again. Each time she spoke about Dr. Carter, more people reached for their wallets. "Your story touched my heart," one parent said, writing a generous check. "Dr. Carter helped my little brother once," another student shared, adding her allowance to the growing pile. When Dr. Carter arrived later that afternoon, Ruby stood proudly behind the table, holding a thick envelope. Her eyes shone with joy as she held it out to him. "This is for your clinic," she announced, her voice full of pride. Dr. Carter's eyes welled up as he embraced both Ruby and Grace, overwhelmed by their thoughtfulness. The morning sun filtered through the freshly cleaned windows of Dr. Carter's nonprofit clinic. Colorful drawings decorated the walls, many of them created by Ruby and local children. The modest building had been transformed from an empty storefront into a warm, welcoming space filled with hope. Dr. Carter stood at the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived for the opening ceremony. His tie was slightly crooked, and his eyes were tired from weeks of preparation, but his smile was genuine and bright. "Welcome, everyone," he said, his voice carrying across the small crowd gathered in the waiting room. "This clinic represents a dream that wouldn't have been possible without two very special people." Grace wheeled herself to the front of the room, Ruby standing proudly beside her. Though still recovering, Grace's voice was strong as she addressed the crowd. "When I was injured," Grace began, "I thought my daughter and I would be lost forever. But Dr. Carter showed us that kindness can change lives." She paused, wiping away tears. "He didn't just save my life, he gave Ruby a future." Ruby guided small groups through the clinic's hallways, pointing out examination rooms and explaining the clinic's mission with the confidence of someone twice her age. "See this room?" she said to a cluster of visitors. "It's specially designed for children who might be scared of doctors. And over here, we have a small library where families can learn about health and medicine." Throughout the morning, families from the community began signing up for services. Dr. Carter and his small staff welcomed their first patients, while Ruby helped people fill out forms and made them feel comfortable. During a quiet moment, Ruby approached Dr. Carter. "Can I volunteer here on weekends?" she asked. "I want to help other families like you helped us." Dr. Carter's eyes softened. "I'd be honored to have you here, Ruby. You already understand the most important part of medicine, caring for people." As the first patient left the clinic with a prescription and a smile, Dr. Carter stood between Ruby and Grace. "This clinic wouldn't exist without you," he said softly. Ruby smiled, feeling the warmth of knowing she'd helped create something meaningful. Ruby stood at the entrance of her new classroom, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. The science honors class was a big step up from her regular classes, but she knew she was ready. Grace stood beside her, leaning on her cane but beaming with pride. "You've got this, sweetie," Grace said, giving Ruby's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Remember how far you've come." Ruby nodded, adjusting her backpack filled with new textbooks. The classroom was bright and spacious, with lab tables instead of regular desks. Scientific posters covered the walls, and a periodic table stretched across the front of the room. As the weeks passed, Ruby found herself excelling in ways she never expected. Her teacher, Dr. Martinez, noticed her exceptional work in their DNA modeling project and her thorough understanding of cellular biology. After school, Ruby would hurry to Dr. Carter's clinic where she helped organize patient files and watched him work with families in need. "You have a natural instinct for this," Dr. Carter told her one afternoon as she helped him stock supplies, "just like your mother has a fighter's spirit." One day, Dr. Martinez pulled Ruby aside after class. "I'd like to nominate you for the Young Scientists Summer Program at Metro University," she said, handing Ruby a brochure. "It's competitive, but I think you'd be perfect for it." Ruby rushed home to show Grace the brochure. They sat at their small kitchen table, looking through the program details together. "This could be your first step toward medical school," Grace said, her eyes shining. "Remember what I always told you? Nothing can stop you when you put your mind to it." That evening, Ruby sat at her desk, carefully crafting her application essay. She wrote about the long nights in the hospital, watching her mother fight her way back to consciousness. She described how Dr. Carter's compassion had shown her the true meaning of being a doctor. Her words flowed easily as she explained how these experiences had sparked her dream of helping others through medicine. When the acceptance letter arrived, Ruby's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Grace watched from their small living room, holding her breath. "I got in!" Ruby exclaimed, her voice cracking with emotion. She ran to her mother, letter clutched tightly in her hand. Grace wrapped her arms around Ruby, holding her close. "I knew you could do it," she whispered, happy tears falling down her cheeks. The summer sun painted long shadows across the university campus as Ruby walked toward the science building, her new navy dress swishing around her knees. Grace had worked extra shifts at her new job to buy it, wanting Ruby to feel special on her first day. Dr. Carter and Grace flanked her sides, their presence giving her strength. "Look at all these laboratories," Ruby breathed, taking in the gleaming buildings and bustling walkways. Inside the orientation room, dozens of other students milled around, some looking as nervous as Ruby felt. The room buzzed with excitement as program coordinators handed out name tags and schedules. "Hi, I'm Maya," said a girl with curly hair and glasses. "Are you interested in neuroscience too?" Ruby's face lit up. "Actually, yes. I've been reading about brain injury recovery since my mom." Before she knew it, Ruby was deep in conversation with Maya and two other students about their shared medical interests. Grace and Dr. Carter watched from nearby, exchanging knowing looks as Ruby's initial nervousness melted away. The first lab session started shortly after. Ruby's hands trembled slightly as she put on her first real lab coat. The instructor demonstrated how to use a microscope properly, and Ruby's eyes widened as she looked at cell samples for the first time. "Mom, look!" Ruby called out excitedly, waving Grace over to peek through the microscope. "These are actual human cells." Grace squeezed Ruby's shoulder, remembering the little girl who used to stack chairs in the pediatric ward. Dr. Carter stood nearby, watching Ruby help another student adjust their microscope settings. "I can't thank you enough," Grace said softly to Dr. Carter, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything you've done for us." "She did all the hard work," Dr. Carter replied, smiling as Ruby confidently explained cell structure to her new friends. "I just opened a door." As the orientation session wrapped up, Ruby joined her new study group near the main building entrance. She stood tall, her name tag proudly displayed, looking completely at home among the other young scientists. Grace and Dr. Carter watched from the shade of a nearby tree as Ruby disappeared into the building with her group. "She's going to change the world someday," Dr. Carter said quietly. Grace nodded, wiping away happy tears as they shared a proud smile. Years later, the same university campus was filled with proud families watching their graduates receive their medical degrees. Ruby stood at the podium in her graduation gown, her voice clear and strong as she addressed her fellow graduates. "My journey to becoming a doctor began in a hospital pediatric ward," she began, her eyes finding Grace and Dr. Carter in the audience. "Where my mother's strength taught me never to give up, and where one doctor's kindness showed me the true meaning of healing." Grace dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Dr. Carter patted her hand. They watched Ruby accept her medical degree, her smile radiant under the summer sky. The following Monday, Ruby walked through the doors of Dr. Carter's nonprofit clinic, now wearing her own white coat. The same bright walls and children's drawings welcomed her, but this time she wasn't a scared little girl, she was Dr. Ruby Thompson, ready to help families like her own find hope and healing. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.